Okay. So I really had, like, when I left last week, I was like a little undecided in our direction for this week. It's part three of three. And as I was prepping, I'm like, I really could use the four. But I debated between bringing in the brachot that Moshe gives these same tribes later on, which is a fascinating thing. In some cases, it's identical, and in some cases, it's not. But I felt like too guilty leaving Yosef and Yehuda out. So I went the Yosef and Yehuda direction. Even though they're more well-known, we skipped over them as we went through the brachot to the other brothers. But I felt like Yosef and Yehuda kind of earned their due, deserved their moment in the sun. Perfect. I was stalling for you guys. Okay, if you want to. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So I really felt like they needed their moment. And although we know a lot about them, we'll try to bring in stuff we already know about them into the context of the bracha that Yaakov gives them, and then perhaps expand on that for some deeper meaning. So Yehuda's bracha comes before Yosef, so we'll start with Yehuda, but we only have, as opposed to last week where we had 7 brothers on tap. Tonight we have 2. We're going to focus on 2. So let's start by looking at Yehuda's bracha. Let me just make sure my sheet matches yours. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So in our first source here, we see the bracha to Yehuda, and Yehuda and Yosef definitely, interestingly, have the longest brachot. So there's the most information, and Yaakov gives them the most kind of fleshed out bracha. So Yaakov says, Yehuda ata yoducha achecha, yadcha be'oref oivecha yishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha. Yehuda, your brothers will praise you. Your hand is at your enemy's neck, and the sons of your father will bow to you. Gur aryeh Yehuda miteref b'nei alita. Yehuda is like a lion cub. He's risen from the prey, P-R-E-Y. Kara ravatz ka'aryeh. He crouches like a lion. Ukelavimi kimenu. We actually read Yehuda's bracha the first week. He crouches like a lion, and who dares rouse him? Who dares wake him up? Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda. The scepter will never depart from Yehuda. Umnechokek mi bein raglav, or the ruler's staff from between his feet. Ad ki yavo shilo velo yikat hamim. Until the tribute comes to him and the praise of his people will be his. Osri legefeni ro, he tethers his donkey to a vine, ulis reka b'nei atono, and his donkey's foal to a vine. He beis bayayin levusho, he washes his garments in wine. Uvedam anavim suto, his robe is washed in the blood of grapes. Chachlili einayim miyayin, his eyes are darker than wine. Uleven shinayim mechalav, and his teeth are whiter than milk. Sorry, there's a strange message. Okay, no polling session. Okay, no problem. Okay, so it's an interesting bracha. Let's see what we can make of it. And based on what we already know about Yehuda, I don't think we're going to learn anything we never knew about Yehuda, but let's see where Yaakov is drawing this information from for his bracha and what his long-term message is to Yehuda. So let's start with that first phrase, Yehuda ata yoducha achecha. So just like when Yaakov blessed Dan last week, he started with Dan Yadin Amo like Ke'echad Shiftei Israel, and we saw Rav Hirsch said that's an introductory phrase. He's just saying, guys, Dan's a real tribe. Now let me tell you what his blessing is going to be. Rashi interprets this phrase, Yehuda ata yoducha achecha, not as a piece of blessing or praise or rebuke, not as a message to Yehuda, but as a generic opening, not generic, but as an opening message. So let's see how Rashi interprets those 4 words. He says, Lefisha hochiach et harishonim bekinturim. Who came before Yehuda? Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. We mentioned 2 weeks ago, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi did not get a bracha. They got a kind of negative message, right? I don't want to call it a curse. It wasn't a curse, but they got a pretty negative message. So now it's Yehuda's turn. And what is Yehuda thinking? I do not want to go next, right? Do not want to go next. It's like everyone's getting roasted, and he's like, I really don't want to. I'm like, I'm okay. And he literally starts backing away. Hitril Yehuda nasog la'achorav. Because those who went before him got some negativity, Yehuda literally starts backing away. Shelo yochichenu al ma'aset tamar. Because he knows there's rebuke in store for him. He hasn't done everything right. Specifically, says Rashi, a reference to the story of Yehuda and Tamar, which is going to come up a few times tonight. It's a pretty big incident in Yehuda's past. And he knows. He's like, oh, yeah, Shimon and Levi, they did a bad thing. They got called out. Ruvain did a bad thing. He got called out. I did a bad thing. I'm just not prepared to get called out. Like, I'm not feeling it. Therefore, ukira'o Yaakov b'divrei ritzui. So Yaakov says, Yehuda, ata yoducha achacha, you're getting a good one. Your brothers, it's going to be praise. Like, you're getting a nice word. Come, you can come back. You don't have to worry. I'm going to say something nice about you. Yehuda lo ata kemotam. You are not like them. Okay, so he did do something in his past, which is negative, but Yaakov's not planning on rebuking him for it, which is fascinating. And we may have known that already just from reading the bracha. There's no rebuke in the bracha to Yehuda, even though he's done something in his past that isn't something to be proud of. So we have to kind of figure out why Yaakov wouldn't take an opportunity to rebuke Yehuda like he rebuked Reuven, Shimon, and Levi for the stuff that they did, and why he's only going to look at Yehuda with like those positive rose-colored glasses. It happens to be that Unclus is going to help us out there. So Unclus doesn't read that first 4 words, Yehuda ata yoducha achecha, as an intro. He reads it as part of the bracha. He reads it as part of the praise. And Unclus does something fascinating. So again, remember, Unclus's job is simply to translate the Torah into Aramaic in the days before, even before Rashi, right? In an attempt to make the Torah more understandable to the masses. Aramaic was the spoken language. Hebrew at that time was just a scholarly language. So it's like the art scroll of today, right? We can't all read the psukim and understand their meaning, but we can take an art scroll off a shelf and we get some help. So Unclus's job was to be the Aramaic art scroll. But just like art scroll does, right? When there are words that have nuance or are difficult to understand, art scroll has to take a position. They have to pick a connotation, or they have to sometimes interpret what the word means. So I say this in my classes all the time to my students, every translation is actually an interpretation. There's no such thing as translating from one language to another, not just Hebrew. Anytime you translate, you're inputting your own connotation or understanding of the nuance of the word, and Unclus was no different. So Unclus reads something really interesting here. He says, Yehuda ata yoducha achecha. He says Yehuda, okay, sorry. He reads the pasuk differently. He reads it as Yehuda ata. You are a Yehuda. We'll see what that means. And yoducha achecha. And your brothers are Yehudas. Meaning, if you pay attention to the shoresh of Yehuda and yoducha, the shoresh is the same. It comes from the word lehodot, which might mean to think, but it really means to acknowledge. Okay, so to think, to acknowledge with thanks, okay? So Yehuda and Yoducha is a cute play on words, says Unclus. They come from the same shoresh. So what does this mean? Says Unclus, Yehudaat, you are a Yehuda. What does that mean? Odeta velo behetata. You admitted, Odeta, from the same, I'm not an Aramaic scholar, but from the same shoresh. You acknowledged, velo behetata, and did not delay. Bach yodun achicha. Therefore, your brothers will acknowledge you. So just like you acknowledged, Yehudata, you were an acknowledger, velo behetata, and when you acknowledged, we don't know what yet, you acknowledged without delay. And therefore, as a reward, yoducha achecha, your brothers will acknowledge you. So when did Yehuda acknowledge without delay? So that brings us to source 3b. And it's a whole parak of Chumash. I whittled it down to 3 psukim. But we're back to the story of Yehuda and Tamar. And this approach of Unclus is going to help us understand why Yaakov chose to see the positive in the incident with Tamar and not the negative in the incident. He could have rebuked Yehuda for what he did with Tamar. He could have even rebuked Yehuda for what he did to Yosef. There's like a lot of rebuke that's a cloud of guilt hanging over Yehuda's head. But what is it that Yaakov chooses to focus on? So Yehuda and Tamar, I'll really recap very briefly, but Yehuda has a daughter-in-law, Tamar, and she marries his oldest son. The oldest son dies before Tamar becomes pregnant. So he gives his second son as a yibum marriage to Tamar. That son also dies before Tamar becomes pregnant. Now Yehuda's a little nervous about the third son because Tamar has a terrible track record. Right now, it turns out the psukim are very clear that it's the boy's fault and that Tamar is innocent and righteous and wonderful. And for one reason or another, that's not our topic for tonight. The 2 sons of Yehuda have to die before getting Tamar pregnant. So she's now in a yibum relationship with the family of Yehuda, and there's 1 son left. Yehuda has no interest in marrying that third son to Tamar. She's killing all his sons in his mind. So he says, let's give it time. Sheila, my third son is still young. You'll go home, you'll wait, we'll be engaged for a long engagement. And ultimately, you'll marry him one day. And of course, the time comes and the time goes, and Sheila, the invitation is not forthcoming. So Tamar has to dress herself up as a prostitute and sit by the side of the road and trick Yehuda himself into sleeping with her and impregnating her. And that's a fulfillment of the Yibum relationship. She knows it's sort of her job to get pregnant with a baby from the family of Yehuda. 2 sons are dead. 1 son is being kept hidden from her. So she does this trick where she dresses up as this prostitute, tricks Yehuda. Not really. He's interested in sleeping with the prostitute. He has no idea it's his daughter-in-law. She becomes pregnant. He finds out she's pregnant. He has no idea it's his baby. And he's very angry with her, right? What a loose woman. She's supposed to be engaged to my son. All of a sudden, the engagement is back on, right? She's engaged. She's an Eshet Ish, actually, according to halacha. So this is adultery. She had an affair and she became pregnant. So that's where we're picking up in source 3b. So Vayhi Kimishlosh Chadashim, 3 months into her pregnancy, which is when she started to show, and therefore people started talking. Vayugad liYehuda le'mor zantat tamar kalatecha, your daughter-in-law committed an act of adultery. V'gam hine hara liznunim, and she became pregnant from that act. Vayomer Yehuda says, Hotziyuha v'tisaref, take her out and burn her at the stake. Punishment, it's a terrible crime. Himutzeit, so they summon Tamar. V'hi shalcha el chamiha le'mor, and she sends a message to her father-in-law, and she says, oh, I forgot one part. Sorry, it's the most important part. So when they sleep together, he says, as all prostitutes do, she's charging for her services, and he says, I'm going to pay you a really good sheep, but I don't have it here. And she says, no problem, I'll take something as collateral. He's like, okay, what do you want? She's like, basically your ID. Leave me your driver's license, your passport, and your social security card. Your staff, your cloak, and your ring. Okay, these are your signature things. This is your signet ring, your special staff, and your cloak, recognizable anywhere. It's Yehuda's. So no problem. She keeps the collateral, and he says, let me go home and get the sheep, and I'll trade you. He tries to send her the sheep. She's nowhere to be found because she's not findable. She's not really a prostitute that sits by the crossroads. She's really Tamar, and he doesn't think to send this to Tamar. So fine. Now back to our story. He says she has to be burned at the stake. So she sends a message to him and she says, no problem. You can burn me at the stake, but one thing first. I want to first identify who the father of the baby is. La'ish asher eilelo anochi hara. The man who's the owner of these 3 pieces of ID, that is who got me pregnant. Vatomer, and so she says to him, here's the rod, here's the staff, here's the ring. Hakerna, do you recognize these 3 things? To whom do these staff, ring, and cloak belong? Okay, that's like a whole shiur in and of itself that we're not going to get to do, but ask me about that one after. That's like the best pasuk in the Chumash. Okay, Vayaker Yehuda, and he's like, oh shoot, that's literally my ID. Like you might as well have my picture on it. It's mine. Everybody knows. Vayomer tzadkami meni, and he says, she's right. I messed up. Now, you might think he's just saying she's right because he got caught. I say that to my kids all the time. You can't only be sorry after the consequence. You have to be sorry for doing the thing, right? It's not the same when I say you're grounded for life and they go, but I'm really sorry. No, you're not. You just don't want to be grounded, right? It's tzadkami meni. We might interpret it as he's like, oh my gosh, no, you're right. Because now he's on the hot seat, not Tamar. But what does he then say? Ki al kain lo netatiha l'sheila b'ni. I didn't do the right thing. I withheld my son Sheila, that 3rd son. I didn't fulfill the Yibum marriage. And then they're not intimate together anymore. It's not a real marriage, but she does give birth to Yehuda's 2 children. Okay, so Onkelos' play on words here is suggesting that it's precisely because Yehuda was able to say, I made a huge mistake. I did something wrong. Not because he was called out, but because he then went back in his thought process and went, I really messed up. Like, let me tell you all the things I should have done better in this story. That the acknowledgement of his mistakes earns him the acknowledgement of his brothers, right? That's sort of Onkelos' play on words. And that quality is actually really essential for the future king. Why is that quality essential for the future king? So kings have lots of power. And when you have lots of power, you tend to get a little carried away with your power. And you need to have enough humility to note that you are accountable to someone. You're accountable to God if you're a Jewish king. You're accountable to your people if you're any king. And you have to have enough humility to recognize that you're accountable. So taking accountability, tzadkami meni, I messed up, the ability to take accountability is like probably the number one qualification for kingship. There are other things too. You have to have other good qualities. We mentioned Yaakov's sifting through his sons to look for those good qualities, but it's precisely this quality that says to Yaakov, yeah, Yehuda did some bad things, but this is not rebuke worthy, because what he did at the end was acknowledge his mistakes, and everyone's going to make mistakes. It's about whether you can acknowledge that you made them and be accountable to them and say, I was wrong. I messed up. I was wrong. And this is not going to come as a surprise as you turn the page, but in source 3c, we note that our greatest paradigm of a king, David HaMelech, who is from the tribe of Yehuda, is also famous for expressing this exact same quality in a very similar situation. So when David commits his mistake with Bathsheba, he gets called out by the Navi. Natan HaNavi comes to him and he gives him the whole parable of the man, the rich man and the poor man and the one sheep, and you took that poor man's, you have 1,000 sheep, you took the one sheep, right? What would you do to the man who took the one sheep? And David says, terrible, he's guilty. Right, and Natan says, "Ata ha'ish," right? So also great scene. And in that rebuke from Natan is where we pick up in source 3c. Madua bazita dvar Hashem la'asot hara be'enai et Uriah hachiti hikita b'cherev. You did all these bad things. You killed Uriah. The et ishto lakachta l'cha li'isha. You stole his wife. The oto haragda b'cherev b'nei Ammon. You sent him out to war and you killed him. Right? The ata lo tasur cherev mi beitecha ad olam. Now the sword will plague you, right? Destruction and fighting will plague your house forever. Ekev ki bizitani, because you scorned my laws. You thought you could do anything, David. You're a king. You thought like, oh, I can take this woman. I want her to be my wife. I'm the king. I have all the power. I can do whatever I want. V'tikach et ishet Uriah hachiti liot lecha liisha. Ko amar Hashem hineni mekima lecha ra'a mi beitecha v'lakachti et nashecha leinecha. I'm going to do all these terrible things to you, says God. I'm going to take your wives away from you, and I'm going to give them to your friend. Turns out to be his son. And that friend will sleep with your wives in front of everybody. Also, this is also like a really great line, because you acted in private. I'm outing you for what you did in private, and I'm going to show you up in public, says God. You thought this is private, it's not, it doesn't matter, and there's real rebuke there. The king thought, but this isn't political. I can't make mistakes when it comes to politics. I'm a king, but this is my private life. Remember, like, I don't know, all our presidents, I smoked, but I didn't inhale, right? Like, it's my private life. What does it matter, right? So says David, this is private, says God, but you don't have a private life. You're a public figure. You can't have a private life that you can't vouch for in public. Vayomer David al Natan, Chatati Lashem. And then there's like the samech of the Parsha Stuha. That's like a drop the mic. Chatati Lashem, awkward pause, right? Vayomer Natan al David, okay, Gam Hashem ha'evir chatatcha lo tamid. Okay, I'm lightening your sentence. You won't die. Hey, things are going to happen. I'm not taking away your sentence, but God is pretty happy with David for doing exactly what Yehuda did, which is instant acknowledgement of his sin. So that's, again, turning his biggest mistake into what might arguably be his greatest quality. And that's why we don't see Yaakov rebuking Yehuda for that Ma'aseh Tamar, but we actually see that fold itself in some way into the praise of Yehuda as, is this the best quality in the world or the worst quality? We don't know, but it's a kingly quality. It's required for a king. And so therefore, Yehuda, you need it. And it's not even like cool or ironic, but like Yehuda is the first king from Malchut Beit David. David is the first king from Shevet Yehuda, said it backwards. So this bracha to Yehuda gets fulfilled for the first time with David. And David it's like a little mini microcosm of the Yehuda story. David goes through the exact same thing. And I think there's a message there, right? That this is going to be the national character of the kings from Yehuda, that they're going to have this quality and their ability to admit mistakes. If we were giving a shiur about David, we might even bring in the fact that Shaul, who was actually the most upstanding citizen in his private life, had trouble admitting his mistakes. They weren't as big of mistakes as David's, but he stood by them. He stood by his mistakes. So when the Navi called him out and said, but you were supposed to kill the whole Amalek, he didn't say, Chatati Lashem. He said, yeah, but you know what, I thought, no, you We can't have a king like that. That's not the quality that a king needs to have. So David, it's more than just David being like Yehuda. It's the whole interplay between, the house of Shaul and the Malchut that came from Binyamin, which was not destined to endure, and the Malchut that came from Yehuda, which was destined to endure because it had exactly this quality. Okay, we're not even going to get to Yosef if we don't speed through. Okay. Ibn Ezra in source 4 actually sees Yehuda's kingship stemming from a different source, not from his ability to admit, but from the fact that his Yadcha be'oref oivecha, right? Yehuda ata, tishimcha, you're a Yehuda, v'chein yoducha achecha, and therefore your brothers will acknowledge you, source 4, v'kasher yir'u ki yadcha be'oref oivecha, when they see that your hand is at your enemy's necks, meaning that you are so victorious over your enemies, yishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha, they will bow and acknowledge you as king. And this, in fact, is what we saw happen. When did we see this happen? Says Rashi, source 5, Bimei David. Again, David's the first king from Yehuda. So like everything that Yehuda is promised is going to materialize in the actual person of David HaMelech. Yehuda is the potential for kingship. That's the bracha. David is the realization. And there were many kings after David also, but David is like every king after David in Malchut Yehuda is compared to David. Lo halach b'derech David aviv or halach b'derech David. There's no other standard in Malchut Yehuda. David is the gold standard. And there were other good kings, and there were even other great kings, but David was like in a league of his own. Okay, like we would say the Nevi'im. We have great Nevi'im, but they're not Moshe. Okay, David is in a league of his own. So everything that is potential to Yehuda, like, oh, your hand is going to be at your enemy's neck, says Rashi, Bimei David, right? And where does that happen, actually? Where do the other tribes acknowledge David? So it's interesting, if you think back to that part of Sefer Shmuel where David is, there's a few times, where David is fighting Goliath. And first of all, he defeats Goliath, and then all the women sing. And they say Shaul killed thousands, but David killed tens of thousands. And all of a sudden, all the attention is on David. He's not even the king yet. But we start to see that he's gaining a following, right? The people are going to be drawn to you. They're going to acknowledge you as their king. Says the Ibn Ezra, it's going to be when Yadcha be'oref oivecha, when you show them that your hand is at the nape of your enemy's neck. And that's exactly what happens. And then David continues to be a warrior king. And not only does Shaul realize that David's going to be the next king, but the people just are drawn to him. And even at the beginning of his kingship for the first 7.5 years, where he's splitting it a little bit with Beit Shaul, with the son of Shaul, Ishbosheth, slowly but surely, Team David wins everybody over. Starts as the king of one tribe and becomes, in 7 short years, the king of all 12 tribes. So that's the fulfillment of that prophecy, according to Ibn Ezra and Rashi. Okay, let's keep going. In Yehuda's bracha, Gur Aryeh Yehuda miteref b'ni alita. Right, you're a lion's cub, and you rose above the destruction of my sons. This is also, according to Rashi, a specific reference to Yehuda's past. Miteref b'ni alita, you rose up from the predatory nature of my other sons. Says Rashi, Mima shechashadeticha b'tarof Torah Yosef. I suspected you were involved in tarof Torah Yosef, in the preying on Yosef, something, oh my gosh, Yosef has surely been devoured by a wild animal. I suspected at the time you had something to do with it. V'zehu Yehuda shenimshal le'aryeh. I thought you were the lion that tore Yosef apart. But silakta et atzmecha, but you withdrew yourself. Ve'amarta mabeta, guys, we can't kill him, right? Let's not kill him. It's Yehuda's idea to sell him instead. V'chein baharigat Tamar shehuda, and again with the story of Tamar, tzadka mimeni, Yehuda is able to rise above, says Rashi once again. He's able to rise above. He has his moments. He sometimes falls into doing the wrong thing, but ultimately, Yehuda is able to rise above. So both with the incident with Tamar and also in the sale of Yosef. And if we really were spending a whole 3-part series on Yehuda, we would note that he really struggled early on with his morality. He had great leadership qualities from the start, right? Every time he speaks, the brothers listen. It's instant. The psukim record it. It's very clear. The Torah wants you to realize Yehuda is the guy that he talks, everyone listens. The problem is if he tells them to do something bad, they also listen. And it's his own morality that, the story of Tamar and the sale of Yosef, it's his own morality that gets called into question. So he doesn't have to work on his leadership qualities. He has to work on his morality. And Yaakov's blessing him and praising him that he is able to really fight the moral fight and come out victorious, and that he should continue to be able to fight that moral fight and come out victorious. It's interesting. Sforno in source 7 reads this pasuk totally differently. Sforno says, "Miteref b'ni alita ata, Yosef b'ni alita mitarfo." You didn't rise above the devastation or the destruction of the other brothers, but instead, Yosef had the power to destroy you, and he spared you. You didn't rise above, you escaped. Because Yosef was kind. You narrowly escaped the destruction of my son Yosef. He did not in his anger destroy you, even though of course he hated you. You ruined his life. And then you also made him the greatest ruler of the world at the time. Why did Yosef spare you? Because you crouched like a lion, says the English is great, in repose. What does that mean about Yehuda? That he knows also how to hold himself back. That he's not always a lion on the attack, but sometimes he's a lion in repose. And that's also a great strength. Knowing when to use your strength and when to harness your strength and not use it is also an essential quality for the king. You can't always go full throttle against all your enemies. Sometimes you have to be more diplomatic. And that seems to also be a strength, according to Sforno, that Yehuda shows. Okay, Tosfot. In the source number 8, the Da'at Zakenim Yivali Tosfot has a totally different approach as well. And this one takes us again back to David HaMelech. Al Yedei Teref Na'alita Bimei David Shabai Mi Yehuda Sha'al Yedei V'chulei Sha'asalo Kadosh Baruch Hu Min Ha'aryeh V'dov. Remember, when David approaches Shaul, when the whole Goliath thing is going down, so Goliath has issued a challenge to the Jewish people. He's like, I'm one man. Let's make it a fair fight, one-on-one. Right? And nobody volunteers. Everyone's quivering on the other side of the valley, and you've got this giant in the valley, and especially one person who should be rising again to the challenge to face Goliath, and that's the king, Shaul, right? He's also quivering in his tent. And David comes up with this very small swagger, right? The psukim are very careful to describe. He wasn't a big guy, and he swaggers up there, and he says, I got this. And Shaul says, no, you don't got this. And David says, really? Because I killed a lion and I killed a bear and I survived. And you know why? Because Hashem helped me. And Hashem will help me here too. And Shaul's like, okay, great. And that's the moment, of course, the turning point for David and Shaul. It's that, by the way, in like just another Navi moment, is the moment where we as the reader are supposed to realize David is the true king. Shaul, the king, is supposed to fight the giant. That's the man-to-man fight. The giant is the strongest on that side, and the king is supposed to be a warrior and be the strongest on our side. And the fact that Shaul doesn't do it is a real put down of Shaul. And then David swaggers on the scene, and he has nothing going for him whatsoever except Anochi ba, elav b'shem Hashem. All I have, my only weapon is God, is Hashem, and I'm so willing to use it. And he wins. So says the Da'at Zakenim, Yehuda rose above, Yehuda in the form of David, rose above the lion and the bear. And how did he rise above the lion and the bear that he killed in the field? Because his emunah was so strong. His faith in Hashem was so strong, he was unstoppable. And that's the same faith that he applies to his fight with Goliath. And that's also the same faith that makes that a moment of transition from the kingship of Shaul to the kingship of David, which is fascinating. Okay, one more word about Yehuda. Maybe two more words, and then we'll turn to Yosef. This is the important part, not that the rest wasn't important. Okay, so finally Yaakov says, Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda. The scepter will never depart from the tribe of Yehuda. And according to Rashi, source number 9, that bracha has long-reaching implications far beyond the time of David HaMelech. So Rashi says, Mi David va'elech. Okay, of course, David is the material form of all the potential that Yaakov is investing into Yehuda. But mi David va'elech elu roshei galuyot shebebavel. Not only in the kingship of Yehuda, but even when the Jews went into exile, the exilarchs, the leaders, the roshei galuta, the heads of the people in Galut that were appointed by the Babylonians, were all from the tribe of Yehuda. Okay, so this lineage, this leadership, it's not just about succession to the throne in the kingdom of Yehuda, but it's going to extend even beyond the confines of the Malchut itself, and it's going to extend into the leaders that are picked, the Roshei Galuta. And then Rashi says, wait, even further, source number 10, Melech HaMashiach. This lineage, Lo Yasur Shevet Mi Yehuda, this promise to Yehuda that the scepter will never depart his tribe, is for time, all time, okay? Until the time of Melech HaMashiach, Shehamlucha Shelo, who will be a reigning king, right? Says Rashi, beyond the days of David, beyond the days of Tzidkiyahu, who's the last king of Malchut Yehuda, into the Galut, back to Shivat Zion in the form of Zerubbabel, who's not a king but a governor, but he's identified as being from the house of David, and then even beyond into the days of what we hope for, Yemot HaMashiach, the tribe of Yehuda will be the reigning tribe. And that brings us to one of the last psukim in the bracha, Osri la gefeni ro lasrikha b'ni atono. He saddles his donkey and ties it to a vine. So Sforno reminds us, these are actually signs of the ultimate coming of Mashiach. He's going to manifest himself as a rider of a donkey, which is a nevuah. And he's riding a donkey because he's not riding a horse. A horse is an implement of battle. By the time Mashiach rides in on his donkey, those wars will have been fought and won. We will be in a place of peace. So he's going to ride in on his donkey because that's a harbinger of peace. And second, the fact that he's going to tie his donkey to a grapevine. The Kerev Yisrael Shanim Shalula Geffen. He's going to attach himself to the grapevine. The grapevine is a metaphor for the Jewish people, as mentioned, says here in Chulin and also in Yeshayahu. I actually read an interesting piece, which I didn't quote, but by Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who says actually the vine is representative of the abundance of nature that's going to precede the coming of Mashiach. And I just have to say this cool story because I promised my son that I would. When we went to Israel a couple of years ago, it was my kid's first trip. And everyone had like their aha Israel moment, which was like the whole goal. I don't care what your moment is. It could be the food court in the mall. It could be Ma'arat HaMachpelah. It could be shopping in Ben Yehuda. I don't care. You just have to have the moment, right? So one of my son's moments was ATVing in the Gush. So of course he's a teenage boy and that's fun. But you know how like in Israel, any tour guide, they could be the most secular person. They know like every pasuk in Tanakh and they're quoting it, you know, and that's also an aha moment. That was like my aha moment every day. Again, but our tour guide, who was a pretty secular guy, pointed out that in the valleys that we were careening closely to, you know, falling off the cliff into, and yeah, they made me drive, and I was like, this is the scariest thing. It's like literally filled with grapevines. And the tour guide pointed out, by the way, these grapevines are hefker, like we don't even pick them. They don't belong to anybody because there's too much grapes. There's just too many grapevines. Like we don't know what to do with all these grapevines. And then he opened his Tanakh like from his back pocket, and he read whatever pasuk, I wish I had it in my back pocket, that one of the simanim of Mashiach coming is so many grapes, so many fruits and vegetables and crops growing that we don't know what to do with. And I literally saw my son get the chills. It was like the cutest thing. And now he won't admit it now because he's too cool. But it was like an amazing moment because he was like, and it's a sign of Mashiach. And I was like, I know, it was amazing. And it is a sign of Mashiach. So peace and prosperity are two of the simanim of Mashiach being here. And peace and prosperity are what Yaakov is blessing Yehuda with here at the end of his bracha, right? The donkey is a symbol of peace and the grapevine is a symbol of prosperity in the abundance of grapes that it'll grow. So the bracha to Yehuda ends on a messianic note, which is, by the way, we started 2 weeks ago and we said, Bikesh Yaakov legalot et haketz. Yaakov wanted to reveal those messianism, and we said we rejected that opinion, but there was a lot of messianism and Mashiach stuff in our messages to our brothers. Yosef will be quicker, I promise. Okay, so let's look at now the bracha to Yosef. Okay, Ben Korat Yosef. There's no good translation for that. I looked at several. A vine, a fruitful vine, a charming son. Okay, Ben Porat Yosef, Ben Porat Ale Ayin, charming to the eye. Banot Saada Ale Shur, everyone marched along to see him. Vayimararu varobu, they put bitterness upon him, and they fought with him. Vayistamuhu ba'alei chitzim, and they, like the archers, shot their arrows at him. Vateshev be'itan kashto, but his bow was strong. Vayafozu zero'e yadav, and his arms, it says here, were gilded. Midei Abir Yaakov, from the arms of the mighty one of Yaakov, God, Misham Ro'eh Even Israel. And from there he sustained the rock of Israel. Also a reference of God to God. Mekel avicha v'yazreka ve'et shakai v'ivarechaka. Sorry, that's a hard one to say. Birchot shamayim me'al birchot tahom rovet tacha birchot shadayim v'rechem. He's going to bless you. God will bless you. The God of your father will help and bless you with the blessings of heaven and the blessings of the deep. The blessings of, here it says, mother and father, the breasts and the womb. Birchot avicha gavru al birchot horai. The blessings of your father surpass even the blessings of my parents. Ad ta'avat kivot olam. The ends to the ends of the everlasting hills. Tiyena l'rosh Yosef u'lekat kod nazir echav. May they come onto Yosef's head and to the crown of the one who is the nazir echav. We're going to have to work on nazir echav, exactly what that means. Okay, so Rashi offers a variety of explanations of Ben Porat Yosef. What does that mean? Ben Porat Yosef, Ben Porat alei ayin. He's charming to the eye. All the girls march to see him. So Rashi in 13a, b, and c, I'm going to paraphrase a little, gives us a bunch of explanations from the most literal to the more midrashic. So one of the more literal answers is a reference to Yosef's great beauty, and that in Egypt, all the girls were fawning over Yosef. And we have midrashim that suggest that. That's how he met Osnat, the daughter of Dinah, right? Everyone's throwing their necklaces at him, and hers says Bat Yaakov, or Beit Yaakov in some opinions, right? And he's stunned because, like, that's his niece, and he's like, how did we find each other here? Okay, so we know Yosef's very good looking. Aisha Potiphar is interested in him. And so the literal explanation may be that the girls are all, climbing up the walls to get a better vantage point so that they can view Yosef. Rashi then goes on and he gives answers that are a little bit more midrashic in nature. So he says, possibly this is a reference to Yosef being the fertile son, like we said, that fruitful grapevine, Ben Porat, we don't know exactly what that means, because he's going to give birth to two tribes, the tribes of Ephraim and Menashe. And interestingly, in Rashi here, source 13b, he says it says banot sa'ada, the banot instead of banim, the plural daughters, not sons. And you would think we would find the word banim because it's Ephraim and Menashe, but says Rashi, it's a reference to the Benot Tzlafchad who are going to come from the tribe of Menashe. So a little shout out to Benot Tzlafchad. And then says Rashi, there's another option that it's about, Ben Porat Yosef, that he was like a tall son who like rose to his greatest height. And that's based on the midrash that when Yaakov is coming back from Lavan's house back into Canaan and he's on his way to Hebron, and he meets Esav again for the first time in, over 20 years, and they're going to have this reunion, and Yaakov's very concerned about who's going to stand where, and he wants his most precious, people in the back, so he puts Rachel and Yaakov in the back. And in the other organization, the mother came first and then the sons, Leah and then her sons, Bilhah and then her sons, Zilpah and then her sons. It says the Medrash, Yosef saw the look in Esav's eyes, and he put himself in front of his mother, and he drew himself up to his full height, and he like blocked her from the view of Esav, which is very cute. And that says Rashi is what Yaakov is praising him for. Like I saw you grow there. You drew yourself up to your full size. I saw you grow like almost like into a man, and because of that, you're going to grow as a leader even more. Your leadership will continue to grow. That was real leadership that you demonstrated. You stood up, and may you continue to stand up, which is very nice. And then finally, Chazal in 13c, Chazal view possibly this alei ayin, Ben Porat alei ayin, as olei ayin, the evil eye, the ayin being the evil eye. And the bracha there, according to that, the Gemara in Masechet Sota, is that the sons of Yosef, the tribes of Yosef, will not ever be able to be influenced by the evil eye. If you believe in the evil eye, fine. If you don't, fine. But that's, the Gemara has that opinion that the blessing here is that Yosef's children will not be susceptible to the evil eye. Okay, let's go on a little bit. Source 14, Rashi. So the next phrase in the Psukim, that his life was bitter and full of quarreling, and the arrows kept firing at him, right? So says Rashi, where was the bitterness in Yosef's life? Vayamaruhu echav, his brothers made his life bitter. Vayamaruhu Potifar ve'ishto, Eshet Potifar, and then Potifar threw him in jail, made his life bitter last row. Lashon vayamaruhu et chayehem, and drawing on the famous concept of Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, right? That Yosef is the first Jew to go into Galut in Egypt with a lowercase GM, Galut Mitzrayim, and it's setting the tone for what Galut Mitzrayim with a capital GM is going to be for the children of, starting now in our Parsha and Sefer Shemot. The experience is going to be bitter, and that same word is used. That's not a coincidence that Yaakov's using that word, because a lot of what we're going to see quickly in the bracha to Yosef is this distinction of being the first Jew to survive Galut. And that's going to be something that we need to borrow from a lot in our history. So from that point on, we're going to go into Galut after Galut after Galut. And what Yosef, remember last week we said each tribe contributed their thing, and we got, strategy from Dan, and we got, being just working the land and being a simple person from Yisachar, and we got commerce. What do we get from Yosef? So we're going to see that Yaakov's going to really be focusing in Yosef's bracha on this aspect of Yosef, that he was successful in surviving Galut, and that's something we're going to need to learn from him. That's going to be Yosef's contribution. Sforno actually explains the arrows a little differently. He says, Ba'alei lashon hara, the arrows, the shooters of arrows, the archers, is actually a metaphor for those who speak lashon hara. Like every word that comes out of your mouth that hurts another person is like shooting an arrow at them, at their feelings. Kinyan chetz shachut lashona mehem. So that's based on a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Who were these slanderers? Lashona, Mehem haya sar hamashkim. One of the slanderers was the Sar Hamashkim, who gets released from prison, forgets about Yosef entirely, and then 2 years later says, ooh, I know a guy for your dream, Paro, Shami Tanu, we were in jail, the Shami Tanu Na'ar Ivri, Eved. Oh, a Na'ar is a put down. An Ivri is not a put down to us, but it was meant as a put down. And Eved is a put down. So says Sforno, the Sar Hamashkim is demeaning Yosef when he mentions him to Paro. He's slandering Yosef's character. He's putting him down, Na'ar, Eved, Ivri. And who else slandered Yosef? K'tzat Avdei Paro, some of Paro's servants, She'amru Chazal, Masachet Sota, She'amru Lamelech, Eved Shekana Oto Rabo Be'esrim Kesef Yimshol Aleinu. You bought the guy for 20 silver pieces. Now you want him to be the ruler of the land. So there were detractors for Yosef, and those slanderers made Yosef's life difficult, says the Sforno, but we'll continue with Sforno, source 16. Promise we're going to be pretty much on time here. Sforno then takes the next pasuk, Vateshev be'itan. You can see the Dibur HaMatchil in source 16, but Yosef's arms, his bow was strong, and his arms were gilded, and Hashem saved him, right? What does that mean? So Sforno says, first of all, Kashto shel Yosef lirot chetz al Misaprei lashon hara yashva be'itan, right? Vehu hamelech. Where was the strength in Yosef's bow? It came from Paro, because who defended Yosef against all those slanderers? Paro. Paro would defend Yosef against those slanderers. Be'amro el avadav. We see this quote in the pasuk. Hanimtza kazaish asher ruach Elokim bo. Okay, he was a slave, but have you ever met anyone who has the spirit of God and wisdom in him like Yosef? That's Paro's defense, says the Sforno, against the slanderers. Ube Amro, and again, he says to Yosef, Ein navon b'chacham kamocha, you're the best there is. And then in the next piece, Vayivzuz ro'ei yadav, what does it mean? His arms are gilded. B'netinat taba'at Paro al yado. And he's also wearing Paro's ring, gilded, right? So you might slander Yosef, says the Sforno, but Paro's got his back. He's given Yosef his ring and his words of approval and his recommendation, and that's really all Yosef needs to stand up against the slander. However, says the Sforno in the third little piece in source 16, Omnam zot hahatzala vehahatzlacha hayta lecha midei avir shel Yaakov shemekayem epanav. But your success in Galut didn't come from Paro having your back. Your success in Galut, says Yaakov, and I want you to remember this, came from Hashem having your back. It was not about Paro having your back. That's not how you successfully survived Galut, but it was Midei Abir Yaakov. He saved you. right? He saved you from the archers who shot their arrows of slander. It was God who saved you and God who protected you. It's very interesting because as we turn to the last page here, Perek Lamed Het of Birchot is the story of Yosef and Potiphar's house. And it's an interesting perek. I have like, a little English teaching background. And so this perek is like a fun literary, it's also Chumash, it's more than a literary perek, but it's a fun literary perek because it is like a mirror structure. So there's like 6 psukim at the beginning, and then I think it's like 3 or 4 at the end that are almost exact mirrors of each other. And the end of the perek echoes what happened at the beginning. So they're like bookends to the story of Yosef and House of Potiphar. And what happens, the psukim, I don't have them. I didn't, I was trying to be space conscious here. But they basically say, Vayhi Hashem et Yosef, Vayhi ish matzliach, Vayhi Hashem ito b'chol asher hu oseh b'bayit u'basazeh. Hashem was with Yosef, and that's why he was successful. Hashem, everything Yosef touched turned to gold because Hashem was with Yosef. It makes it very clear to us that any success that Yosef achieved in Potiphar's house was because Hashem had his back. And then what happens? Yosef ruins it. Okay, again, we're not learning about Yosef, we're learning Birchot Yaakov, but Yosef ruins it. And so he gets sent to jail. It's not just Potiphar's punishment, it's also Hashem's punishment. You need to learn your lesson a little bit more. And then what happens right when he gets to jail? Vayhi Hashem et Yosef, Vayhi ish matzliach. Even the jail warden says, this guy's awesome, love this guy, I'm going to make him my head prisoner. Why? Because Hashem had his back. And we realize it right away when we read Perek Lamed Het. It takes Yosef until Perek Mem Aleph to realize it. Okay, his mistake is that he doesn't realize that it was Hashem who had his back. He thinks he's going to survive by his own scrappiness, right? And he's going to befriend the right people, and he's going to, I'm very successful, everything I do is so good. And so Yaakov's message to Yosef is, it took you a little time, Yosef, to realize that the secret weapon you had to survive in Egypt was Hashem. It wasn't your own strength, and it wasn't Paro having your back, but it was the strength of Hashem. That's a message that has to endure. Yosef, you've got to carry that message into the future galuyot that the Jews are going to experience, because they're also going to think that they have all these mechanisms and methods. But at the end of the day, it's midei abir Yaakov, it's God having your back that's going to help you survive galut. And then the last line of Yosef's bracha is also a reference to Yosef's successful survival in galut, and it's also a bracha of leadership. So it's that that crown on the Nazir Echav. What is the Nazir Echav? So the word Nazir is interesting. We know a Nazir is someone who doesn't cut their hair and they're separate from everyone else. And a Nazir could also be like interpreted as a prince because they're separate, they're distinct. A Nazir is someone who has distinction, okay? So the crown is on the one who is distinct from his brothers. What made Yosef, according to Sforno source 17, distinct from his brothers? V'zeki bihiyoto nazir mu'atar ben nezer. What does he separate and distinguish himself from in Egypt? All the stupid stuff that was corrupt and immoral going on there. So just like Yehuda, because you acknowledge, you will be acknowledged. Because you were Nazir, because you separated yourself from everything bad that was going on in Egypt, you'll wear the Nazer. You'll wear the crown of distinction. So it's so beautiful. It's a beautiful, like Yaakov's poetry in these brachot. Shalit bein Benezer Shalit bein Echav heidu ma'asav shu ra'ui lekabel brachot. Right? He proves that he's worthy of this distinction. I'm just skimming to make sure. And also says the Sforno, V'chein haya zar'o b'ma'ala karov l'shevet hamalchut. He gets near kingship. He doesn't get kingship, but he gets near kingship. Where does he get near kingship? So number one, says the Sforno, in the form of Yehoshua, who's from Shevet Ephraim, not a king, but in the days before the roles were so clear, Moshe is also referred to in many places as he wasn't a king, literally, but he was like a king, so Yoshua. And then later on, and we usually view this as bad, but here it's a little bit of a bracha to Yosef, when the kingdom splits, the first king and many of the kings in Malchut Yisrael, in the breakaway kingdom of the northern kingdom of Israel, are Yeravam, the first one, is from the tribe of Ephraim. And what's fascinating about this, and we'll end here, is that these two brothers, Yosef and Yehuda, they belong together, and we'll read that in Rav Hirsch for a minute, but they're also going to be locked in struggle for leadership for the rest of time. You think about how many years after these brachot, Malchut Israel was fighting with Malchut Yehuda, a Yosephite king and a Yehudaite king, were fighting over which was the better Malchut. You realize that this rift, and we'll talk about it in a second, it's a rift, but it's because they were like fraternal twins in their leadership. And so says Rav Hirsch, Yehuda and Yosef are strikingly the two central points on which Yaakov's prophetic sight rested. So we dealt with Reuven, Shimon, Levi, we dealt with all the other brothers last week, but it's Yehuda and Yosef who grab Yaakov's attention. They're the central pillars of Yaakov's prophetic sight. And indeed, right up to Yikat Amim, to Ta'avot Kivot Olam, until the most distant future. And in fact, we always find Yosef too at the side of Yehuda. Beit Yosef and Beit Yehuda, there should be an I there in the mouth of the prophets, comprise the whole nation. That's what it is. It's Haben Yakir Li Ephraim. The whole northern kingdom is referred to as Ephraim, and the whole southern kingdom is referred to as Yehuda, because that's the crux, that's the kernel. And even for that distant future, Mashiach, tradition tells of a descendant of the house of Yosef as a precursor and companion to the one from the house of Yehuda, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben Yehuda. The actual relationship is not clear because it is not revealed, but it certainly is not without reason if Yaakov stresses here that the hopes and blessings of that distant future rest also on the crown of Yosef's head as they do on Yehuda's head. Yaakov sees that our national identity is not complete. And I'll just add one layer to it that will literally take 30 seconds. This isn't really about a Yosef and a Yehuda. It's really about a Rachel and a Leah. And that's the bottom line, is that Yaakov, it was confusing to him when he had to marry all those women. He really thought, I'm going to marry Rachel, she's the love of my life, we're going to build a nation together. And that wasn't meant to be. And Yaakov struggles with that. Rachel doesn't struggle with it. Leah struggles with it. Rachel says, take the signs, marry the guy. It's not going to go down like Yaakov thought it was going to go down. But and Bilhah and Zilpah, we're not forgetting them, but they belong on Team Rachel and Team Leah. At the end of the day, our nation had to be built. It's essential. And that's what Yaakov sees in his blessing from both the gifts of Rachel and her team and the gifts of Leah and her team. And as a nation, we really emerged from both of those wombs. And so it's not really a rift that carries us forward into the future, but Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David are not ultimately going to fight over position, but they're going to work together to bring us Yemot HaMashiach. Okay, I'm going to press stop recording here. Any questions?